Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are delighted that you're joining us today for the latest in our Designs on the Future initiative. This is a crazy initiative. It's a conversation with the world that is open to everybody. And for the last few months, while we all coped with the pandemic, we've been asking provocative questions about challenges and opportunities that are relevant wherever you find yourself. And these questions tie right back to Salzburg Global's own radical roots. Today's question, who owns the past? You might be asking, why are we focusing on the past when Salzburg Global is an institution that works to shape a better future? Sadly, if you look around, every country, every region has a history and culture that embeds the use and the abuse of power. Of course, the specifics are very different, for example, between colonizers and colonized. But every country in its own way has complex legacies, traumas, and very persistent and stubborn divides. That received wisdom, that entrenched legacy, is now being questioned in new ways by new voices, with participatory movements for new dialogues springing up around the world. We are seeing growing mobilization against systemic injustice and violence, whether that's rooted in racial, ethnic, religious, or gender-based discrimination or exclusion. Black Lives Matter is, of course, one of the most prominent movements, but it is far from alone. We think that this issue of reappraising the past to generate equity in the present is exciting, urgent, and relevant to every sector of every society and the economy. It's already changing the conversation in corporate boards, around curriculum development, in employment practices, right through to investment. But public spaces, marked out by their symbols, their monuments, and their memorials, have really become one of the most visible parts of this contestation and a flashpoint in many contexts. Many institutions are now grappling with starkly opposed public reactions. They're asking themselves, how can they commit to openness, to knowledge, to inquiry? How can we together build understanding and a kind of collective responsibility to reckon with the past in an honest and open way? And there is slowly the understanding that facing up to this, perhaps an inconvenient truth, is a precondition if we want to live up to what we say on the tin, which is to build more inclusive and resilient societies. Today's debate is really exciting. It's going to bring to life a brand new publication, Contested Histories in Public Spaces, Principles, Process, Best Practices, which is the fruit of a groundbreaking partnership between the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation, which was born at Salzburg Global, the International Bar Association, and Salzburg Global Seminar. There's so many ideas in this book, and you are going to hear a great deal about them today. But this is the time now for action to forge a common framework to progress. And we very much hope that today's debate with you all helps to pave the way for a multi-year collaboration that will link many of Salzburg Global's own networks across the world, whether they're working on peace innovation, on the creative economy, on the future of cities, and much more. Briefly, as some of you know, this topic has very deep resonance for Schloss Leopoldskron, the historic home of Salzburg Global Seminar. And this historic home has a deeply contested history. It was built by Prince Archbishops of Salzburg before Austria existed as a nation, and with what today we would call dirty money, by expelling thousands of Protestant salt workers around 300 years ago. But there have been cycles of power, of persecution and renewal throughout the palace's 300-year history. It was bought at the end of World War I by Max Reinhardt, the celebrated co-founder of the Salzburg Festival. And he transformed the Schloss into a piece of living theatre and a cultural melting pot. Yet the beautiful library where I and my colleagues are now sitting is a direct testimony to persecution and atrocity. Max Reinhardt was Jewish. He was forced to flee from his beloved Schloss in 1938 with the arrival of the Nazis, and he died in exile during World War II. But I mentioned renewal just now, and just 9 years after Max Reinhardt fled, our institution, Salzburg Global, was founded directly out of the conflict of World War II by 3 young people. And the very first winter, we were used as a home for refugees from across Europe. It's a long way back in the past, but so much of that DNA is still present in what we try to do with all of you. We have stood the test of time. We have nearly 40,000 fellows across nearly 180 countries. Equity and inclusiveness remain as proud core values of what we try to do. But we are no strangers ourselves to being critiqued ourselves in the work we do and the way we use our own history. We've been challenged, thankfully, by our own fellows to explore our own past and current practices. And so we ourselves are on a learning journey, and it hasn't always been easy. And we're learning about this balancing act of being stewards of a unique and protected heritage, while also trying to be actors in global change. So it's a reminder to ourselves to live up to our mantra, be tough on the issues and kind on each other. Or to quote our fellow and recent speaker, Stacey Abrams, our time is now. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and I thank our partners and the 21st Century Trust. For those of you who are regulars of the Designs on the Future initiative, you'll know that we experiment every time with different formats in these conversations. Today, we're going to hear first of all from the front line from our fellow Alessandra Cummins in Barbados. We'll then dive into a couple of short case studies contrasting experience in South Africa and Korea. We're then going to build off these to show how the book is illustrating both principles and remedies for application around the world. And then we open it up to all of you for debate. So a big ask, you've got a chat box, you all know how that works. Please feel free to put your own questions in right from the start. We've got amazing colleagues who will be looking at your questions and giving a short list for me to then announce you so you can ask your questions live. And I'll call your names out 3 at a time so that you can then put your question directly. And then at the end, my wonderful colleague Ben Glan will wrap up and highlight some key points. So without more ado, I'm going to bring in our first speaker, Alessandra Cummins, who is the director of the Barbados Museum and the Historical Society of Barbados. And she plays so many lead roles in this area, not least with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience and the International Network of the Slave Route Project. So Alessandra, welcome back virtually.
Thank you so much, Claire.
It's great to have you with us. And I want to first ask you, in your experience and taking the temperature of societies today, do you think rescripting the commemorative landscape is essential to tackle these underlying injustices? Or is there a risk that this becomes a distraction? It actually diverts attention or provides a get-out clause for those who can really need to tackle today's inequities?
Interesting question, because I don't think one could really ask the question about whether rescripting. I think rescripting is going to happen regardless of whether we want it to or not. The question is really the process of rescripting and whether and how it enables various parts of the communities involved, whether it's academic, heritage, or indeed the civil society. And these are divisions which are at best artificial, but which at most could be mutually supportive if we understand that we are all seeking the same goal. So I think rescripting the landscape is going to be is essential, is going to happen regardless, and it's a matter of process that we need to be examining.
Let me just tease you out on this mutually supportive. I mean, we are seeing such deep polarization in many societies, and
Mm.
political and media manipulation and the rise of ethno-nationalism is building bitterness in so many quarters. Who do you see as being able to help lead that process of building a culture of supportiveness and an understanding of shared benefit in this space?
Again, you're asking a question which requires a little bit of breaking down. When we talk about leadership, there are some certain assumptions that are being made. And I think that we need to understand sometimes that leadership comes from within. It comes from within the minds, the souls, and the mentalities of people on the ground who have determined that what is before them is not an adequate representation of who they are today. Therefore, if their leaders in government or academia or where else are not going to take the action, you should expect that the community is determined to take the action. And more today, they're seeing the success of these underlying, if you like, push-pull factors that make them players in the history. I think that the important thing to recognize is that, you know, people are no longer satisfied to have their histories written for them. They understand very well that this is about writing their own histories. And therefore, they're prepared to take forward action. And it's not just about things of heritage, but many other things. So I think that would be my answer on that point.
Well, you just said beautifully the writing the history of the future, of reclaiming agency and voice in the co-creation of that history. And yet we're seeing, if I go back to that question of what are the narratives in the world today, we're seeing that with some groups, for often very understandable reasons, attachment and nostalgia for the past is actually fundamental to what they believe is their own identity and their own safety. These things go very deep in all sectors of society. And how have you experienced that the way of creating psychological safety around this journey that can allow the people who've had no voice to take voice, but the people who may on paper have had voice but don't feel they have that, to also feel that they can not be personally threatened by these developments?
Claire, there's so many scenarios in which this happens, from every place, from the point of view of certain types of visitors visiting plantation sites, normally in North America, and being seriously distressed about the change in tenor of the narrative that is being presented to them, not understanding it, not accepting it, and are seriously threatened by what is being presented as the past. Let's remind ourselves that we're talking about the past. This happens in a number of different locations. I think that what we're talking about and what I'm seeing in terms of many of the questions being raised by colleagues in those contexts, from guiding exhibitions to interpreting objects to reinterpreting landscapes, I think that we're talking about processes that go beyond the heritage professionalism that we have been taught to engage in, to understanding that we're talking about deep psychological and mental injustices that also have to be dealt with. So can we leave it up to the heritage professionals to just reinterpret? No, I don't think we can. I do think we need to engage with mental health professionals who can help us to understand what happens to individuals when they're presented with this other reality which they never knew existed. And there's so many people, you know, that on the one hand, thank the interpreter for giving them a new vision of what took place. And on the other hand, absolutely disputing and bitterly disputing what is being presented. So I think we have to do better in terms of properly preparing our interpreters as to how to present this data and how to understand and deal with the fallout afterwards, because we cannot just leave it to those few to be the front line or the fault line of these interpretations.
This is fascinating because you're really looking systemically at what this paradigm shift involves and getting beyond the transactional and understanding not just more voices to be heard, but more of the stakeholders that can be part of solutions. Just a very quick final question. I feel that the talk of cancel culture and woke is dominating, often in a very politicized way, many media headlines, at least in my part of the world. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we deal with that before we open up to our first case study, or just some reflections quickly.
You know, on the one hand, one can't help but being energized and energized by seeing the enthusiastic response, particularly of young people who are feeling a sense of empowerment because they're finally seeing themselves as part of history. Unfortunately, too much of the past has been about erasure of certain populations. And let us not misunderstand, this erasure has been deliberate, has been systemic, has been ongoing for centuries. And now we need to swing the pendulum. So on the one hand, I'm really thrilled to see that response amongst the young. On the other hand, one can't help but be deeply dissatisfied by the political opportunism that is brought to bear, particularly in media and other circles, where it suits them. Where it doesn't suit them, it's not addressed. And there's a deep puzzlement then as to why this continued imbalance takes place. I certainly subscribe to the view that there's a kind of epistemic injustice to what is being presented in public fora, and that needs to be directly and systematically addressed.
That is such a brilliant way to tee up today's debate. Alessandra, there'll be more questions coming back to you, but now I'm going to pass to our first case study with a quick reminder to all the audience. I think there's already gazillions of questions coming in. Keep them coming. And if you want already in your questions to say who you'd like to answer the question as you listen to people, please don't hesitate. So now case study number 1 is from Shahid Vauda, who's going to talk about South Africa's experience with Roads Must Fall, to show how this kind of case study has helped inform the development of this amazing book. Shahid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire. Greetings to everybody. Before I start, I just want to thank all my colleagues that worked on this research project: June, Bam, Hutchinson, Dudu Ndlovu, and Kashan Pasham. Without them, some of the things that I'm about to say would not have been possible. I've benefited greatly from their own experience of the Roads Must Fall movement and the research that they have done. So then, leaning a little bit on John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, or rather the title, which was about the 1917 Russian Revolution, the removal of Rhodes' statue from the University of Cape Town was as much, was just as important as the Russian Revolution as a symbol of what was wrong with the world. One may think of the subsequent events, or whatever one might think of the subsequent events in post-revolutionary Russia, it certainly shaped the 20th century and pointed to the deeply manifest problems experienced by every country, state, colony and post-colony that was deeply fractured along lines of various prejudicial discriminatory practices, gender, class, systemic racism, political and economic inequalities and injustices. The Rhodes statue is a similar lightning rod. So while the issues that were pertinent to the Rhodes Must Fall movement at the University of Cape Town, such as racial profiling, prejudice, bias, discrimination, epistemological violence, coloniality, and the need for a new curriculum, one may extrapolate from that and say that these are the issues of importance in varying degrees the world over. The Rhodes Must Fall movement was not alone, of course. There were the early Black Lives Matter movement, movements for democracy such as the Arab Spring, the Syrian War, and the triggering of the migrant crisis, protests in the Ukraine, students at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi protesting against religious and ethnic fundamentalism, the attempted coup in Turkey, but also the emergence of retro-white nationalism, made all the more significant by the election of Donald Trump, who refused to speak out against racism, and his tacit support for the continued public monuments in the Southern Confederacy and the myth of white superiority. And of course, we should not forget that the Rhodes Must Fall movement spawned a similar movement at Oxford University and a movement against the statues of Gandhi. This was the local and international context of the Rhodes Must Fall. These are issues that still plague us today, made all the more severe by climate and environmental crises, whose proposed solutions cannot overlook the above-mentioned societal problems. However, today, I'm not going to talk so much about the Rhodes Must Fall movement itself and what it stood for, or how the statue was removed. Rather, in the context of very severe contestation, there was a position taken that the Rhodes removal was, or still is, the erasing of history, and that the rational thing to do was to supplement and add to that history through research and debate. This solution misses the point. It's not about erasing history, but whose history in the present, and with what unfinished future. There's one element of this proposition that I wish to pursue, and that it is possible to have a rational debate. Presumably, where the contesting sides can debate, can differ, but come to an amicable solution that removes the effects of the long history of racial capitalism and modernity's dark side, colonialism. For anyone that finds themselves in such situations, rational debate is not one of quiet diplomacy or negotiations across a table, and then after all things considered, a proposed solution in a logical, almost deductive, although negotiated fashion emerges. I was struck by a question some weeks ago in the Q&A session during the launch of the book Contested Histories, about whether it was possible to anticipate problematic statues such as Rhodes, and including the symbolism and the deeper underlying issues, and whether these could be resolved by rational debate. That there were debates within and with others in the Rhodes Must Fall movement is incontrovertible. The seminar alluded to in the slide on the 16th of March, 2015, was to have been the first of a series of discussions on the campus of the University of Cape Town about transformation-related issues. This was a long-planned initiative, long before the initial protest action. Now, I mention this for a number of reasons. First, it was planned as the kind of envisaged rational discussion, but this prescient planning did not allow for robust debate and protest, regardless of the amount of erudition that could have clearly been displayed by all present. Indeed, it did not happen because students felt that the issues of bias, prejudice, and institutional racism needed to be addressed so that any discussion about heritage and symbolism could only then be thoroughly taken seriously. Secondly, students were inclined to want to participate, but on terms that made them equal partners, rather than being talked to or talked down or lectured on what really happened in history and what might be considered the most appropriate response. Thirdly, in all the negotiations that took place during the Rhodes Must Fall movement, outside of the social media and the public platforms, there was real negotiations, not only on the terms of the removal of the despised statue, but also the terms on which debate takes place and whose voice and interests are heard and taken seriously. And above all, what should follow to address the real causes of the protest. The rationality here of confronting the necessity of radical, progressive, transformative change, not just the symbolism, is not of calm, intense debate with positions taken and defended in some kind of Socratic fashion. Rather, it is of to envisage and locate the level playing fields where there are multiple sources of power at play. The legal and bureaucratic power of the state is represented by heritage resource agencies. The institutional power of a university to impose a solution in a manner that is purported to be within the legal framework. The power of students to disrupt by questioning these very sources and sites of power. And the power of persuasion that academics wield to question the very understanding of rationality and what constitutes democracy. Indeed, the very notion of transformative, affirmative change can be rendered meaningless when the norms of affirmation are still what they were during the apartheid times of a racial contract. Despite the differing powerful voices within the university, it was contended that knowledge production does not necessarily lead or inform justice and liberation, but rather assimilation to coloniality. The mere presence is not enough. So in this real world, where there's multiple levels of power and their historic origins flow, ebb over time, but in these most intense times of contestation, these ratchet up or cascade as irregular waves, and that it's within these that is the recognition of injustices and inequalities that have to be found. And to shift to another level of engagement beyond the formality of rational discourse. I probably will venture to say that with the multiple logics of power and rationality at play, it only begins to make sense when the injustices of positions of power to constrain, to impose, divert, and assimilate do not morph into diversions that detract rather than address contentious issues. Only then can the debate about whose history and what history in the present can be addressed.
Thank you so much, Shahid. That was so much packed in to a short space, and I can see from the chat box that you're already stimulating comments and further discussion topics. Keep those points coming, folks. And now we'll move on to the second case study from Da-Ching Yang, who's going to talk about the experience on a very different set of circumstances from the perspective of Korea. So Da-Ching, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's a great honor to join this panel. I'm not an author of the case studies. I'm not even an expert on this particular comfort woman issue. Rather, as a historian of modern Japan and its relations with Asia, I would like to use this opportunity to provide some background about the highly contested statues of what are commonly referred to as the comfort woman statues, but they're also called the Statue of Peace or statues of young girls. So let me start with this question. What are the comfort women and what are the comfort woman system? Let's see here. Over 100 years ago, Japan was a colonial empire and Korea was made a Japanese colony. And then starting from 1930s, Japan again embarked on military expansion that eventually led to World War II. So when Japanese troops spread all over Asia Pacific, rampant rape was taking place, and the Japanese military ordered the establishment of such comfort station system. And tens of thousands of Asian, mostly Asian women were brought into this system. Korean young women figured prominently, mainly because of their members of the Japanese Empire, subjects of the colony, and ability to speak language, and have been subject to colonial assimilation. And they were spread all over the Asia Pacific region into this system of sexual servitude to the Japanese military. This in Japanese were the euphemistically known as the military comfort woman. But of course, there were also Koreans were recruited as members of labor force as well as the soldiers. 1945, Japan was defeated and the empire collapsed. Korea regained independence. However, when Allies conducted war crimes trials, for the most part, the comfort woman was not taken up. And when the peace treaty was drawn up with Japan by the Allied powers, Korea was excluded. So it was not until 1965 that Japan signed a basic treaty with Republic of Korea, in which Japan provided some economic assistance to a very poor country at the time, Korea. And in return, Korea was supposed to renounce all claims against Japan. So in the early decades after the war, the comfort woman issue was largely forgotten, erased from public memory. It was not until 1980s when, after the democratization in Korea had taken place, some of the Korean comfort women first spoke out. Of course, this is also against the background of Japan's so-called history problems with Asian neighbors began to emerge in the 1980s. And by the 1990s, the global age of memory politics was already taking place after the end of the Cold War. So after the Korean comfort woman first spoke out, they were joined by comfort woman victims from other countries. So in the picture at the bottom, you can see comfort woman victims from China, and as well as from former Dutch East Indies. So that's just a very, very brief background. And now let me talk about the contestations. So in the early 1990s, the Japanese government offered various apologies after historians proved that the Japanese military were indeed involved. So in the photo upper level, you see the then Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei making the admission of direct or indirect Japanese military involvement, and then went on to offer sincere apologies and remorse and promise to forever engrave such issues in our memory. And then 2 years later, under a socialist prime minister, the coalition government set up what is called the Asia Women's Fund. Now, This fund was set up to compensate all surviving comfort woman victims. And the money largely came from private donations. The Japanese government contributed some money for the health care of those survivors. And these payments went out with a letter from the prime minister that offered apology. Now, the problem is that there were dissatisfaction from within Japan and from Korea. In the case of Japan, there were conservative and nationalist elements, citizens groups and politicians who felt this was going too far. They would simply consider the comfort women as ordinary prostitutes, and Japan had nothing to account for. Now, on the other hand, there were citizen group in Korea, and some comfort women survivor themselves felt that such measures from the Japanese government did not go far enough because they did not admit legal responsibility, and the money mostly did not come from the Japanese government. So we can see that from the early 1990s, such contestation already began. So fast forward to 2015, the two governments finally made an agreement that promised to solve the comfort woman issue finally and irreversibly. And with that, the Korean government set up a new foundation, and in this time, the Japanese government made contribution to this foundation in order to pay out to Korean comfort women survivors. And that still raised some problems with the comfort women supporting groups in Korea, and a few comfort women refused to take this money. And this now brings us to some of the questions you see here, is to what extent this contestation was over historical facts. Yes, there were considerable dispute as to the extent of coercion, whereas the nationalists in Japan would deny any coercion, whereas others would consider coercion in a broader sense, especially under the colonial structure Japan imposed on Korea. And has Japan taken full responsibility for past wrongs? The more nationalist element would say there was no legal responsibility anymore after the 1965 treaty, whereas many critics, including comfort women themselves, felt the apologies were not sincere enough, and Japan's legal responsibility should be clearly acknowledged. And this really brings us to the statues. So these statues are different from the other statues, historical statues discussed in the book, because they're new. And the first one went up in 2011, which was the occasion of 1,000th weekly demonstration held by Korean comfort women survivors and their supporters in front of the Japanese embassy. And since then, the statues have taken a global presence. You can see in half a dozen countries, and has almost always stirred up contestations. In some cases, one statue you see here in the upper right-hand corner in the Philippines was withdrawn. And then another one, the middle in the left-hand column, set up in the Philippines with the support of local Chinese and Filipino communities, led to the breakup of sister city relationship between San Francisco and the city of Osaka. So I think I will stop my presentation here, and by end up with this reflection that this has gone beyond simply a Korea-Japan issue because of the global memory culture. As historian Carol Gluck called, the comfort woman issue has become a traveling trope that has been embraced by the global discourse on human rights, especially women's rights in wartime. So I will end here, and I welcome your comments and questions.
That was fantastic, Da-Ching. Thank you so much. And now, as promised, I'm going to introduce two figures instrumental in the new book. Before I do, we told you to get ready with your questions, and the first three questioners after this next segment will be Larry Gardner, then Sarah Hughes, and Tim Weiskell. And so please look at the instructions in the chat box so you'll know how to jump in and we'll be able to see your faces live. So now I'm going to turn first to Tim Ryback from the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation. Tim, briefly, the book is extraordinary in terms of proposing principles for how across the world people can go forward with these kind of situations. Can you just share some of the toughest problems that you faced as a task force team, and we salute all its members, in developing those principles?
Okay, certainly, Claire. First of all, let me add to Shahid's praise of the Cape Town team. They were absolutely sensational with the work they did. To the toughest problem in developing the principles, actually, the principles feel like the easy part, I think only because the rest is so incredibly complicated. I think as we've heard, from Alessandra, from Shahid and from Da-Ching, you have this incredibly complicated situation of the political, the social, the economic, the legal, the diplomatic, the cultural, the ethical, the moral, the historical, the existential, the list goes on and on. And I think the complexity is inherent actually in the nature of the enterprise, contested histories and public spaces. You have this time-space continuum in which past and present remain in this evolving relationship where history is preserved and presented in a material form as statues, monuments, memorials, markers, street names. And it's a reification of human memory or of historical memory. And the point that Alessandra made about the psychology of history, I think, is really important. And you actually allude to that in your wonderful James Baldwin quote, that we are trapped in history, history is trapped in us. And then the question becomes, what happens when these histories are trapped not in people, but in stone and metal? The British historian David Olusogu says that marble and bronze are a terrible medium for writing history. And I agree. And I think we might look at it as sort of the Baldwin-Olusogu nexus. There are these histories that we carry within ourselves, but then there are the histories that we see around us reflected in public spaces, coexisting, but actually more often than not conflicting, especially in multi-ethnic or divided societies. And how do we understand that history that we have within us with the one that we're seeing around us, especially when they're in conflict? Sometimes they're interwoven, sometimes they run parallel, frequently they're irreconcilable. I am actually getting to your question, but I know to understand this is what we were working through to get there. I think the important thing is to understand that this is a global phenomenon. We looked at 260 disputes on all 5 continents and analyzed them. And what you actually see is it's the same dynamic, whether you're dealing with legacies of colonialism, slavery, imperialism, fascism, communism, mass human rights violations, genocide. It's a very similar human dynamic and how they relate to to the built environment, to this reified historical memory around them. And so, basically, what does one do with this? And we tried to distill what we thought would be useful principles that would be globally applicable, but actually locally applicable as well. Because most statues, and this is something that we absolutely saw, statues are experienced at the community level. People live with them. There are very few statues that are experienced nationally. It's the day-to-day, the street names, the statues, the markers, the memorials around you. We've distilled these principles into the book. We can maybe talk about these later. My personal one and my personal takeaway on this is that I think as important as doing the right thing is not doing the wrong thing. And one of the major takeaways from the book, I think the important contribution, are all the cautionary tales that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for just touching on the sheer breadth of the number of perspectives that have to be taken into account and the incredible scholarship of the task force and all the contributors led by Baroness Usha Prashar. There was very sophisticated political and civic society understanding that informed the humanity of the way the task force set about this colossal work. So let me now bring in Marie-Louise Janssen, who's going to talk a little bit with the aid of some slides about how some of those responses and the understanding of the leaders of this project were formulated. Marie-Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. It's always a pleasure to be back at the seminar, even if virtually. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be on this panel with so many friends and to share some of the findings from our work in The Hague. So thank you so much for your question. And that brings a very interesting dynamic into the discussion. But before I jump into that, I'd just like to begin with an observation by Baroness Prashar, who you've referenced. She's the chair of our task force and the guiding spirit to the Contested Histories volume. Usha always says, these controversies are rarely just about a statue. Disputes are virtually always symptomatic of deeper issues within the society. And I think we saw that, we heard that from you, Claire, from Alessandra, from Shahid and Dutching as well. But we can debate these issues, but we are nevertheless still stuck or still confronted with the physicality of the statue, the monument, the object on the memorial landscape. Its size, its location, its imprint on the physical space, its resonance on the collateral spaces, and in particular, its posture and its iconography. And we can learn so much about the values of the society at the time the statue was erected, and even more about how our societies have evolved. When we look at the monument, we have to ask, what is it signaling? What is the messaging? Whose story is it telling? Oftentimes it is the iconography that gives us the answers. I'd like to share just a few examples of the power of iconography, both positive and negative. Picking up on Shahid's remarks, you've seen this, the slide he presented, and I have a couple of these as well. Let's take a look at the statue of Cecil Rhodes itself, the previous one. This statue was built in 1934, 32 years after Rhodes's death, and it was removed in spring of 2015, as Shahid told us. But what do we see when we look at this statue? What iconography is there? We see a white man dressed in a three-piece business suit, seated, hand under chin, gazing ahead. Although he is sitting, you have the sense, or at least I do, that he's moving forward. His left hand is holding what I believe is a scroll, and I checked this with Shahid, and he confirmed that it probably is, likely for the lands that he bequeathed, that Rhodes bequeathed to the university. But these lands were taken and claimed by the British Empire. His right foot is on territory upon which he built his fortune. His hat rests on top. But the placement of this statue also sends a strong signal, and I'd like the next slide, please. So you see this statue, it's on the steps. It's very central, very prominent, very large. This tells you something. It tells you about the importance and the honor, the importance and the power of the man, the power that he held. But what's probably most important, and this is in the next slide, is that Rhodes is looking north. On the plinth it says, I dream my dream by rock and heath and pine of empire to the northward. One empire from lion's head to line. Lion's Head is a mountain peak in Cape Town. You saw it on the previous slide behind him. But the line refers to Cairo. He's dreaming of an empire northward, north through the entire continent of Africa. The white man's dream to conquer a continent. It reveals the mentality and the values of those seeking to expand Britain's hold in the 19th century. This mentality of white supremacy is clear in the iconography, and as Shahid discussed, has informed the systemic racism pervaded ever since. This message is clearly offensive to the Black students, staff, and faculty at the University of Cape Town. They wanted that message gone. And let's take a look at another example. I have another one in the United States. When I first heard that there was a case, that there was a call to have a Lincoln monument in Boston removed, I could only just shake my head. I mean, seriously, Abraham Lincoln, probably the greatest US president and the one who fought a war to free enslaved people. But then I saw this image. And if you look at this image, it's very clear. This is a replica of the original that stands in Washington, DC. As you can see, Lincoln is standing over a kneeling, scantily dressed Black man who is looking up at the president. The figure of the freedman is modeled on Archer Alexander, the last man captured under the Fugitive Slave Act. The story behind the monument is that in 1865, the day after Lincoln was assassinated, a freed enslaved woman started a call to raise money for a monument to Lincoln. She herself secured the first $5 for that statue. Sufficient funds were raised and the monument was designed and commissioned by a post-Civil War relief agency run by whites. Neither the woman nor any formerly enslaved persons were consulted in the design. Frederick Douglass spoke at the unveiling, but he was not especially pleased with the monument. He later wrote in a letter, "The Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude." He said, "What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." Regardless of the statue's original intent, the signaling of the iconography overpowered its intended message. It was awkward when it was constructed in the 19th century. 150 years later, it had become unacceptable. It was removed December 20th, 2020. Next, I'd like to show you a monument with iconography that is simple but powerful. This is the monument that Da-Ching was discussing in his presentation. The narrative relates to the confrontation over the sex slaves in the Second World War. The iconography of the Statue of Peace reifies a human trauma and projects it into the public space. This is a newer monument, as he said, 2011. By its very presence, it embeds that trauma in the memorial landscape, and with that, and becomes part of the collective identity of the community. Here we see a life-size young girl on a chair in traditional Korean dress. Her fists are clenched on her lap in her determination to fight. And if you look at her hair, it is roughly cut. The sculptor who created this said, "The crude haircut symbolizes that her ties with her family and her country were severed." You will notice that her feet barely touch the ground, indicating how these young girls were swept into the comfort women system. They also signal the instability the women found themselves in after the war, shamed and without a place in society. The small bird on her shoulder represents the girl's quest for freedom and peace. It also is a spiritual symbol, linking surviving victims to those who had already passed away. And of course, you'll notice the empty chair. This indicates comfort women who are already deceased and an invitation to others, to all of us, to put ourselves literally in their shoes, in their place. As I said, the iconography reifies a transient historical trauma into something permanent and palpable in the public space. But as Da-Ching said, it's not without contestation. A difficult one. Finally, I'd like to show you an example of the power of abstract iconography to promote a sense of inclusivity in a way that representational signaling cannot necessarily do. This is an installation that was just completed last spring to mark the 250th anniversary of the arrival of James Cook. Claire Smith, an anthropologist and a seminar alumna, led the research for this case study on Botany Bay for the IBA book. In her research, she documented how previous commemorations had been fraught with divisiveness over two conflicting narratives. One that celebrates the European landfall, the quote unquote discovery of Australia, and the other, the experience of the indigenous peoples, one of trauma and disenfranchisement. That left the question for the 250th, how best to commemorate in a way that could bridge two such conflicting narratives. Cook's statues had been repeatedly vandalized. So clearly another statue of Cook, even with an accompanying monument, was not the answer. Instead, the government turned to artists to design an installation that would mark the occasion in a more inclusive way. Here you see the new monument. The iconography indicates the ribs of Cook's ship. It also can be seen as the ribs of a whale that links the indigenous heritage to the land and the sea. And I should mention that the artists who actually created this, it was a team both with people with links to the Aborigine community and to the earlier settlers in Australia. It's truly a beautiful, evocative work of art on its own. It signals multi-perspectivity, inclusivity, and stands as an enhancement to the commemorative landscape. Coming back to the question about artists and artistic interventions, I believe that artists have a significant role, especially for the future. When we looked at all of the different remedies that could be taken with a contestation over a monument or over a memorial or a statue, the artists were the ones who always had the most innovative approaches. And I think what we've learned with the toppling of so many of the monuments and with the questioning of the commemorative landscapes today, there is also now an opportunity to look toward the future, towards designs for the future, designs that promote inclusivity, multi-perspectivity, and can foster more cohesive societies. Tim mentioned principles. Inclusivity, I believe, should be a very key principle in building for the future. And here, the artists designing these monuments have a responsibility to shape the iconography in ways that can help us do that.
Fantastic, Mary-Louise. Thank you so much. And we're going to jump straight into questions. We've got a little under a half an hour for the questions, so please keep them short, and I say that with full respect. I'm going to bring Sarah Hughes in first, who is herself a mental health professional, and then hopefully turn to Larry Gardner after Sarah's question has been answered. Sarah, I think you're hearing me loud and clear, so please jump in. The screen is yours.
Lovely, thank you so much. And I've been really moved by all the speakers, and particularly Alessandra at the beginning, who really honoured the pain and complexity of this situation. And in our work, we found that really thinking through these issues brings about collective and generational trauma. And I guess that my worry is when we're having these conversations, we're sending our brave young people who are taking that position of activism on our behalf into spaces that are often not psychologically or trauma informed. And I worry deeply about that. And we've seen terrible scenes, certainly in the UK, of the consequences of that. And I wonder, how do we both support this activism and this power, and also really recognize the trauma and the risk that is posed to individuals that are bravely stepping forward? And I don't know the answer, and I'm keen to see if we do together.
Great question. Let's throw it to Alessandra.
Thank you, Claire, for
putting you on the spot. I know.
Sarah, I take your point very deeply, and it is from that perspective that I suggest that we, first of all, that we comprehend this sort of situation might almost be, and from the point of view of some of the audience, it might be viewed as psychological warfare. Therefore, we have to better prepare those who have to deliver that information. It can't be left to neutral paperwork or messages on the walls. So where do we start? We have to understand that we are dealing with institutional training. We are dealing with changes in the structure by which heritage, memory, and museum studies all need to be reshaped by an understanding that it's what is being asked of these institutions is not only their responsibility. It is a shared responsibility, and we have to be able to give the tools to those who are being made responsible on our behalf, the frontline people. So I do see that there's work that needs to be done in the heritage, memory, museum sectors, and certainly understanding how that has to be structured into the training that is given there. On the other hand, when we're dealing now with the current present day workers, we're talking about developing capacity building exercises, certainly much greater awareness of the weightiness of what they're delivering, what they're saying, and understanding. I mean, we have to understand that we're talking about situations where people have gotten hurt, in one or two instances have been killed. So we cannot leave it. We cannot leave it to chance and possibility. So there has to be, even in terms of security around these circumstances. I don't want to be alarmist, but I do think we have to be more proactive about understanding how critical it is to build in these knowledges, let me put it that way. And these knowledges often about audience response and development, and how these can crucially shift with just one word. And even the action of turning away from someone to address something else can lead to misunderstandings and misrepresentation of situations. So I think I do think that we have to be proactive in terms of capacity building and training. I think that's the first thing. And even the terminologies that they use when we're delivering this information.
Fantastic. I'm going to read the next question and then throw it back out. And obviously other speakers, if you want to then add more to around Sarah's question, you can feel free. So this question comes from Larry Gardner from the Netherlands, who works with the Dutch refugee and migrant networks. And Larry's question is, does the panel think that the history of empire and colonial expansion should continue to be celebrated and glorified? Or should artifacts of empire simply be consigned to museums with contextual explanations? So would either of our case study contributors like to kick off with some thoughts on that? Daching, you're the first one I'm seeing on my screen. And may I just add, we will have audio recordings or snippets of this, and all the chat will be saved. So please relax and just listen in, and don't worry, we're trying to get as much of this available to you after the event. Daching, would you like to start?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Yes, the current most contested issues in Japan and its former colonies are about those people directly affected, whether it's the comfort women or the forced laborers. But the cultural objects also came up, not as prominently. And this ties into the larger question, how Japan treat its colonial legacy, whether it is a case of developing the colonies or it's an exploitation both of the people and of the societies. So there are also cases of wartime expansion where cultural objects were appropriated and taken to Japan, but it has not gained as prominent place as with European colonialism, for example, the German colonialism in Africa, the Cape Cross. But in Asian case, it is more of those people directly involved, whereas the cultural property issues seem to take a back seat.
Great. And Shahid, do you want to add any reflections to that, or say anything about the mental health dimensions that Sarah was raising?
Mute and run my video.
No problem.
Right. No, I mean, the question around the trauma is certainly a big issue in South Africa, particularly in the Western Cape, which has had the first forms of, or the first kinds of European colonization. In Southern Africa happens at the Cape, and enslavement, the building of wine plantations, all begin here, and the trauma associated with that is well documented. And of course, that means that you have to deal with historical legacies of this trauma, which are even expressed today. One of the outcomes of that long history is high levels of alcoholism, and that of course affects children that are born even today. So that has to be tackled in much more systematic ways than it currently is. On the issue of whether we should be glorifying empires, of course not. This is not to say that we must suddenly disappear empires. It doesn't mean that we mustn't talk about the empires. In fact, we need to talk more about these empires and what they actually did. I think the mention was made of the British historian Olusoga, and he's done a wonderful job of trying to hide how do you understand these empires. In some cases, they were brutal right from the very beginning. In other cases, they were not, because they confronted empires which were of equal strength. Japan, India, China, they couldn't just march into these countries. So different parts of the world had different ways in which they've had to deal with this. But nevertheless, European colonization did take place, and it was brutal in the long run. And we have to deal with this. It can't just be explained away. And yes, de-glorifying that, especially the idea that colonizers were bringing civilization, which is kind of weird, because you're bringing civilization to civilizations that already existed and had long traditions of mathematics and literacy already. How do we account for that? And what did they do to destroy that? Mm-hmm. And that's not just at an intellectual level. They also destroyed the industries that were there in order for their industries to prosper. And so mm-hmm. British cotton is a primary example. Mm-hmm. So we have to tell those stories. Just on the question of whether these should be in museums, certainly in South Africa, museums didn't want the Rhodes statue. Not because they thought it was not their problem. They said they were dealing with their own problems of decolonization. Why would they want to be lumped with another one on top of what they're already dealing with? So, so the question around what do you do with these statues still remains.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. I'm going to pull another question in and then bring in other panelists as well. So this question is coming from Haiti, from Max Jean-Louis, who's the special advisor to the Minister of Culture and Communications. Max, over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the presentation. My question is how to counter the narrative of past glory days used by extremist groups such as in the US, Make America Great Again, or here in Haiti, we had people who said that there were less crime and more tourism during the Duvalier dictatorship. So how can we counter this narrative of past glory days? This is my question.
Fantastic. I want Alessandra briefly first, and then I'll bring in Tim Ryback as an American on the panel.
Claire, can I suggest you go to Tim first and then come to me?
That sounds a very fair treatment after I keep putting you on the spot. Tim, the floor is yours.
I did not hear the question completely clearly. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, it was the question, if I may jump in, Max. How do we counter the narrative of past glory days that are being used by extremist groups such as the MAGA group, Make America Great Again? A little of what I touched on in my own introduction about this lure of the past and the glamorization of sometimes a kind of imagined or mythical past or overblown past.
Education.
Well, this actually touches on this other question, which was asked about how societies are processing or dealing with colonial legacies, meaning in, let's say, in Africa or in the Caribbean. But I think also looking back home, I mean, in France and in the UK, this also has a psychological impact, and I guess in the United States with the Confederate statues, it is, these debates over statues are part of a process. I mean, the scripting and rescripting of commemorative landscapes goes back to the Roman times. I mean, it's to the ancient times. So this always happens. In fact, when you get these disputes, it in some ways elevates the issue to the public level. It gets it out into the open. And one of the best examples I might give is in Bristol, where before the statue of Edward Colston was toppled and thrown in the harbor, they had been taking public opinion polls, and probably 60, 70% of the Bristolians would have agreed that the statue should stand. The interesting thing is, after the Black Lives Matter debates, and the protest finally, and then the dunking of Colston in the harbor, there was actually a change in public opinion, and most people actually realized that the statue should not continue to be there. And it began this debate with Colston. So yeah, I think all of this is a process. It's an ongoing process, but I think these debates over statues bring it very much to the public attention, and these debates should be part of it. And I think it does at least help counter the narratives. I mean, in the United States, it's a more complicated and more depressing dimension to that. But I should say that happily our project we're now in discussion with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has done this landmark work on the Confederate statues. And we're looking to compare the American experience with the global experience. I think it depends on every country, but there are positive examples. I think using this to get the discussion and the debates out into the public is probably the best way to vaccinate the general public against this radicalism from the right and the deniers.
Thanks so much, Tim. And so, Alessandra, do you want to come in on that? And bearing in mind that Max's question was very holistic in a way, if I understood you right, Max, you're thinking about that comprehensive ways. You know, you're sitting in a government position about what does leadership around these issues also look like, if I'm understanding you correctly. Go ahead, Alessandra.
Max, bienvenue à vous. C'est un grand plaisir. So for me, Max, the situation that you're asking about, yes, we do need to look at what are good examples, what are useful examples from wherever you can pull them. I do not wish to suggest that this example or that one is particularly stellar, but maybe useful examples for you to then adapt and adopt. So in the context of Barbados, the debate around the removal of Nelson started in the 1960s. It gathered momentum in the 1990s. The Prime Minister then, Prime Minister Owen Arthur, declared the renaming of Trafalgar Square as National Hero Square in 1999. So you can imagine a context in which we now have a National Hero Square and a Nelson statue, a colonial memorial. This was clearly a mismatch which needed to be addressed. So initially, there were several government consultations, internal consultations between government and academia and heritage experts that led to reports and recommendations to government that the statue should be removed from public view, and various proposals were that it should be put in place in other sectors. Nothing happened. So what happened then in 2020 to spur the movement? People understood entirely what the history was. But it had been, until that point, held almost as a personal project, or something that interested only the historians. But in 2020, things changed, because in 2020, both the activism of youth before Black Lives Matter, but the activism of youth was saying this statue should not be here. And that they gathered signatures, I think over 8,000, 10,000 signatures. And that was presented to the ministry. So we already knew that something was going to need to happen. What happened from there were a series of public consultations. And it is in that context that there was freedom to say and assert different perspectives. It is in that context also that you, if you have the right circumstance, you enable the community to take part in the decision-making process. And I can't emphasize too strongly that being part and parcel of the decision-making process enables the sharing of responsibility and the sharing of ideas. And it is that I'm trying to get at as a critical moment. That then informed government of the need to move forward. Yes, Claire.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But I think that was a great answer. I was also so impressed that I realized that Max had a real tree behind him, and you have a I'm not sure if yours is real or pretend, but if you're both under palm trees, we're all very jealous. Now, Salzburg, as many of you know, is really intergenerational, and I'm thrilled that we've now going to introduce Brandon Mock, who is a student at Cambridge. Brandon, the floor is yours, and I'd like Marie-Louise to be the first person who has a crack at answering your question.
Hi,
so Brandon, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This was super interesting. So my question comes from the perspective of media studies from my background in comparative literature, and it comes in 3 parts. So how do we define what a contested place is in the time of social media when statues can be reproduced in images and videos? Do we need to consider the ways in which virtual space can be sites of contestation? And this leads into the last part. How would we even conceptualize contested virtual space in theory and history? Do we need different tools, different vocabularies, or do we stick with the ones that we already have for physical spaces? Thank you.
That is an incredible question, and I have a feeling it may feed a Future Designs on the Future webinar in its own right. So Marie-Louise, you talked so much about iconography, so I think this is a great question for you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's fascinating. It's interesting. It's one that we haven't actually grappled with yet in our cases, in our studies. I mean, we do look at planned memorials, planned monuments, etc., but we haven't really looked at the virtual space question. And how do we define what a contested legacy is in a virtual space? Well, that's something I think your generation will probably know better than mine, but it is something that I think we can think about. And how do you define a contestation? Well, I think it's I think first of all, it is listening to the people's voices. I think that's very clear from all of the contestations that we've looked at. Who's discussing this? Why are they discussing this? And how strong are their voices? And are they being listened to? And the problem I think in Bristol has been that actually that contestation was brewing for such a long time, and it really wasn't addressed at all. It was put off. They decided not to put up a plaque after they had decided, etc. So it's listening to the voices, I think, is very clear. And in the virtual space, I guess my point would be that we need to be listening to that space. We need to be listening to the people who are engaged in conversations in those spaces before we can actually really discuss how to address that. I really don't have an answer for you specifically. Well, I do think there is a lot of room for exploration there.
You're absolutely right. And I have Da Ching, who is dying to come in with a word. So Da Ching, over to you.
Thank you. I have no intention to downplay the importance of the virtual space. Indeed, a lot of this contestation are taking place in the cyberspace, but in the case of the comfort woman statue, the physical space really matter. Like I said, the first one in Korea was erected right in front of the Japanese embassy, and that gave the Japanese government a reason to blame the Korean government or the Korean civil rights groups. And if you look around the world where these comfort women statue, the so-called comfort women statue coming up, exact location matter a great deal, whether it's a public land or private land, what country, and this ties in to the power structure down to the municipal level, as well as the international level, because where the geopolitics can also come into play. So in that sense, physical space still have a lot of relevance.
Great. So we're going to have our final question with Sandy Nairn, who I think is in the UK, and I'm going to be completely unfair because I'm going to ask each panelist to answer in one sentence to Sandy's great closing question. So Sandy, you can be the hated one because over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for such terrific elements of debate and discussion. My question's about the future of commemoration. And I'm wondering whether panelists think we should now say no more statues, only poems and planting and improved public spaces. Perhaps if I'm honest a little bit, I'm thinking of examples like the great Mai Lin Memorial for Vietnam in DC, where there are only names and space, but perhaps no more statues.
Okay, fantastic provocation to finish with. So one answers in a sentence, starting with Shahid.
Okay, I don't think we can say no more statues. I think my experience here in South Africa is that we've got both new statues. Even the new statues are contested, but there's also spaces where Freedom Park, which speaks directly to the Voortrekker monument, speaks in a very different voice to it. It's not monumental, it's not in your face. It speaks to inclusion, and it speaks of liberation, but liberation in a sense of liberation from a range of issues, not just racial discrimination, but also of material conditions. And so it speaks a very different language to that of monumental empire type statues.
Great, I'll stop. Great answer. I'll stop you there and pass to Tim.
I'll suggest something that actually works very well, tried and true, and that is statue parks. You round them up and you put them in one place. It's worked in India with the colonial legacies. It worked in Taiwan. It's worked in the Soviet space. And I hope they may find a solution for Confederate statues in the United States like that. If they're problematic, find a place to park them and leave space for new representations, not necessarily statues.
Well, that was not just an answer, it was a call to action. So good on you, Tim. Daching.
I very much sympathize with the question, but if the intention is to remove contestation over history, I think we may be overly optimistic, because if anything, it will move into other realms, whether it's history textbooks or other realms.
Okay, so that was also some realpolitik thrown into Daching's answer, which makes a lot of sense. Marie-Louise.
Well, Usha Prashar would say no more statues, take them all down, but I don't exactly agree. I do think they're needed in some cases, and what I like to look at are statues that are inclusive. And I mentioned that before in my talk, but also, for instance, in Estonia, they didn't want to put up another statue to a historical figure, so they put up a statue to kissing students at a university town. So that's something that inspires, that brings some of the history, the fact that this is a university town, to the forefront. And I think there are creative ways to bring monuments and commemorations.
I bet I'm not the only one listening who is imagining students being able to be together and to kiss in the middle of a global pandemic. We've all forgotten about this. And for our very last answer, we have Alessandra.
I am sorry, I'm an art historian and I cannot live without art. However, my answer is not about the object, it's about the process. My answer is no installation without consultation. If you have not consulted, you have no authority to install anything. And the final part of that is that I think what needs to undergo a sea change is that we cannot in the future consider permanence as a criteria for the installation of these monuments. We have to understand that history changes, and with it, the monumental markers that we leave behind.
That's fascinating. And your words remind me of a really powerful impact of Salzburg Global in the field of health, which is nothing about us without us, which now is changing the face of healthcare around the world. And what you just said goes to that very heart of personhood within these paradigm shifts. So I'm full of a wow factor, but luckily it's not me who has to synthesize. My wonderful colleague Ben Glan is now going to close off for about 5 minutes and give thanks to everybody. But thank you from me personally.
Thank you, Claire. And I'm going to wait for your microphone to be off. Let me try again. Just give us one moment and we will get the technology worked out shortly. I think it worked. Great. Thank you, Claire. And let me just start before we officially close the program today by thanking our speakers and our moderators, as well as all of the contributors to the Contested Histories project who have really guided and informed this work over the last many years. I'd also like to thank Tim and Marie-Louise from the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation for their leadership of the Contested Histories project, and to the International Bar Association and the 21st Century Trust for the really excellent partnership and cooperation we have with both institutions. I'd also briefly like to thank our back-end staff who aren't in the video screen, but who solve problems like feedback and technical noise when the moment requires it, and who help prepare and develop and plan these designs on the Futures programs. This doesn't happen on its own, and we really could not do this without them. In closing, though, let me just offer a few summary thoughts from today's program. I think that the examples of contested histories in public spaces that we've heard today don't only represent contested monuments and contested spaces, but rather they reflect a more fundamental responsibility that we all share to address historical injustice, to honor and recognize the fullest expression of diversity in our historical narratives and commemorative landscapes, and to build a more cohesive and inclusive set of historical narratives for the future. As we've explored today the question of who owns the past, I think what we have heard is, in part, something of an answer to that question. We've heard that we all have a collective obligation to confront and understand our shared histories, not in a single moment of controversy, but through a consistent and enduring rescripting of the narratives that societies tell themselves about their past and about the histories that need to be included to realize a shared vision of the future. We've heard that no single narrative or group owns the past, but that national identity and cultural sustainability require a serious and sustained approach to historical accountability. and that progress depends really upon the courage and the leadership of people to seek out and demand that historical accountability. And I think we've heard today that that comes through 4 primary things: a factual, truthful, inclusive, and complete set of historical narratives. It comes about by redressing historical injustice and engaging multiple voices to uncover the complete truth of the past, no matter how uncomfortable. By making inclusive additions to our historical and commemorative landscapes in ways that reveal and uphold histories that have remained hidden or untold. And by recasting public spaces in ways that enable diverse communities to see themselves in our commemorative landscapes, while engaging artists and young people to reflect the fullness of those histories. Finally, I think that our speakers today and the global nature of these contestations have shown that a true and full accounting of the past requires us to see here not single isolated controversies over memorials and statues, but to recognize an ongoing, global, and evolving reckoning with the past and with epistemic injustice in ways that seek out the most complete, accurate, and truthful expressions of the past that is possible. As Alessandra said at the start, people are no longer willing to accept their histories being written for them. Rescripting is happening everywhere, whether we like it or not. And in short, we are now living through a period in which we are rewriting the history of the future. So as we look beyond this program today, we'd like to invite you all to continue to engage with us. There are a series of products from this program tonight, a recording of this webinar, some short social media video clips, and other audiovisual materials that will be shared in the coming days. We'll also be moving forward with our partners at the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation on a series of next steps on the Contested Histories project. So please stay tuned for more information on that. And Salzburg Global also has an ever-growing range of open access online programs. So please join us and spread the word. Finally, a slight divergence from our normal programming, and before we close. After 9 years and the leadership of hundreds of Salzburg Global programs, today is the last day that Claire Schein is serving as Vice President and Chief Program Officer, and this Designs on the Future will be her last program at Salzburg Global. So I have the distinct and yet distinctly bittersweet honor on behalf of Salzburg Global and our partners to thank Claire for the extraordinary leadership of our program since 2012 and to send her off to her new post as director of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership with our deepest admiration and our sincere well wishes. Claire's leadership of our programs, including her establishment of the Designs on the Future series, has been exemplified by a uniquely Claire approach to our work. She has exemplified a rigorous approach to systems thinking and transformation across our programs, alongside a deeply human approach to the values of our organization. In short, she has always combined the deeply intellectual with the deeply emotional in everything she's done. Over the last 9 years, Claire has also always looked beyond our own walls and sought to create inclusive and open designs for Salzburg Global and our programs. She's worked with and befriended people from literally every corner of this fragile and beautiful planet. And we take comfort in the knowledge that in her new role in Cambridge, she will be equally dedicated to the sustainability and diversity of our world. So as we send her off, we therefore asked our local florist to prepare something fitting and symbolic of her work, not only with us, but in her future. So as a symbol of our appreciation, this bouquet of flowers includes every color and every type of flower we could find, and serves as a thank you from Salzburg Global for all of your work with us, Claire, as well as a colorful expression of the importance of the work that you have ahead of you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you all soon. And in the meantime, we hope you all stay healthy and well. Thank you all. Thank you, Claire. Goodbye from Salzburg.